What if I told you that a man who lived over 2,500 years ago wrote a book so powerful that it still required reading at West Point, quoted by corporate CEOs, and sits on the desks of world leaders today? What if the same man might never have existed at all? And what if his greatest weapon wasn't the sword, but the mind? Welcome to today's episode, where we dive deep into one of history's most enigmatic and influential figures, Sun Tzu, the legendary Chinese military strategist whose 13 chapters of wisdom changed warfare forever. But here's the twist that historians debate to this day. Was Sun Tzu a real person or a brilliant composite of ancient Chinese military thought? Did he actually command armies, or was he a myth created to give authority to revolutionary ideas? Today, we're going to explore the life, the legend, and the lasting legacy of the man behind the art of war. We'll uncover the mystery surrounding his existence, the brutal realities of warfare in ancient China, and most importantly, why his strategies are more relevant today than ever before. Whether you're interested in history, strategy, leadership, or just love a good mystery, stick around. Because by the end of this episode, you'll understand why Sun Tzu's words have echoed through millennia and continue to shape how we think about conflict, competition, and human nature itself. So let's begin our journey into ancient China, where kingdoms clashed, philosophers debated the nature of power, and one man, or perhaps one idea, would change everything. To understand Sun Tzu, we first need to understand the world he inhabited. Picture China in the 6th century BCE, during what historians call the Spring and Autumn period. This wasn't the unified China we know today. Instead, imagine a fractured landscape of warring states, each vying for dominance, each ruled by ambitious lords who knew that survival meant constant vigilance and superior strategy. The Zhou dynasty, once mighty and centralized, had fragmented into dozens of feudal states. These weren't small territories. We're talking about kingdoms with millions of people, sophisticated bureaucracies, and armies numbering in the tens of thousands. The state of Wu, where Sun Tzu allegedly served, sat in the southeastern region near modern-day Suzhou. It was a rising power, aggressive and hungry for expansion. This was an era of unprecedented intellectual ferment, while battles raged across the Chinese heartland. Philosophers were revolutionizing human thought. Confucius walked the same roads as Sun Tzu, preaching moral virtue and social harmony. Laozi was developing Taoist philosophy, speaking of the way and the power of yielding. It was China's golden age of philosophy, the 100 schools of thought, where every major question about governance, ethics, and human nature was being debated with fierce intensity. But here's what makes this period particularly brutal. Warfare was becoming more sophisticated and more deadly. Bronze weapons were giving way to iron. Chariot warfare was being supplemented by massed infantry formations. The old aristocratic codes of combat, where nobles fought nobles in something resembling a deadly tournament, were breaking down. War was becoming total, ruthless, and strategic in ways that had never been before. Into this cauldron of violence and innovation stepped our protagonist. Or did he? The historical sources are frustratingly vague. Here's where our story gets really interesting. The primary historical source for Sun Tzu's life comes from Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian, written around 100 BC. That's about 400 years after Sun Tzu supposedly lived. Imagine trying to write a definitive biography of someone from the 1600s using only oral traditions and fragmentary texts. That's the challenge historians face. According to Sima Qian, Sun Tzu was born as Sun Wu in the state of Qi around 544 BCE. His name itself is fascinating. Sun was his family name, while Tzu simply means master or teacher. So Sun Tzu literally translates to Master Sunday. Already, we see how this might be a title rather than a personal name, a red flag for historians trying to verify his existence. The historical record tells us he came from a military family and received an education in both military arts and classical literature. As a young man, he supposedly left his home state of Qi and traveled to Wu, where he sought employment with King Helu, one of the most ambitious rulers of the era. But here's the problem. Other than Sima Qian's account, we have almost no contemporary evidence that Sun Tzu existed. No inscriptions mention him. No other historical texts from his time period reference him directly. The art of war itself doesn't contain biographical information. Some chapters seem to reflect different time periods, suggesting multiple authors or later editions. This has led to a fierce, scholarly debate. Some historians argue that Sun Tzu was indeed a real person whose teachings were later compiled and expanded by his students and successors. Others suggest he was entirely fictional, a personification of Wu state military doctrine. Still others propose that Sun Tzu represents a school of military thought rather than an individual. And you know what? For our purposes, it almost doesn't matter, because whether Sun Tzu was one man or many, whether he lived in the 6th century BCE or his work was compiled over centuries, the ideas attributed to him are undeniably brilliant and historically transformative. But for the sake of our narrative, let's follow the traditional account and see where it leads us. The story of how Sun Tzu entered King Helu's service is itself a masterclass in strategy and psychological insight, and it reveals something profound about the nature of leadership and discipline. When Sun Tzu arrived at the court of King Helu, he was unknown, an outsider from a rival state. The king had heard of his military theories, but remained skeptical. After all, China in this era was full of wandering scholars and self-proclaimed experts. What made this Sun Wu special? According to legend, King Helu challenged Sun Tzu, "I've read your treatise on military strategy, but can you apply these theories to actual people? Can you discipline and drill anyone to become effective soldiers?" Sun Tzu confidently replied, "Anyone can be trained, Your Majesty, even palace women." The king, intrigued and perhaps amused, decided to put Sun Tzu to the test. He assembled 180 of his concubines in the palace courtyard and handed them over to Sun Tzu for a military drill. The king, his ministers, and courtiers gathered to watch what they assumed would be an entertaining failure. Sun Tzu divided the women into 2 companies and appointed the king's 2 favorite concubines as company commanders. He equipped them with spears and shields, then addressed them with crystal clarity. "I assume you know front from back, left from right?" The women, giggling and treating this as a game, confirmed they did. Sun Tzu continued, "When I say eyes front, look straight ahead. Left, turn to the left. Right, turn to the right. About face, turn around. Is this clear?" Again, the women agreed, still not taking this seriously. Sun Tzu then had the orders written down, explained them multiple times, and positioned the drums and flags. Everything was prepared with meticulous clarity. Then he gave a command, "Right turn." But instead of executing the order, the concubines burst into laughter. The courtyard filled with the sound of their amusement. They were palace women, decorative members of the court, not soldiers. This whole exercise seemed absurd to them. Sun Tzu remained calm. According to his own principles, he announced, "If instructions are not clear and orders are not fully understood, it is the commander's fault." He then repeated the instructions even more carefully, ensuring every woman understood exactly what each command meant. Again, he gave the order, "Left turn." Again, the women laughed and failed to execute. Now Sun Tzu's expression changed. According to the historical account, he declared, "If instructions are clear and orders are fully understood, but soldiers do not obey, it is the fault of the officers." He then ordered that the 2 company commanders, the king's favorite concubines, be executed for failing to enforce discipline. The king, watching from his pavilion, immediately panicked. These weren't just any women. They were his beloved companions. He sent a messenger rushing to Sun Tzu. "I am now satisfied that the master is capable of commanding troops. Without these 2 concubines, my food will lose its flavor. I request they not be executed." Sun Tzu's response is legendary and reveals everything about his character and philosophy. He replied, "Having been appointed as commander, there are orders from the sovereign which I cannot accept." And he executed the 2 concubines on the spot. The courtyard fell into shocked silence. Sun Tzu then appointed 2 new commanders from among the concubines and resumed the drill. This time, when commands were given, the women executed them perfectly. They turned left, right, and about face with precision. They advanced, retreated, and knelt according to orders without a sound, without a single mistake. Sun Tzu sent a message to the king. "The troops are now properly disciplined and ready for inspection. They may be deployed as your majesty sees fit, even through fire and water." The king, still grieving and angry over his concubines, did not come to inspect. Sun Tzu observed, "The king merely likes the theory of warfare. He cannot apply it in practice." Despite this tension, King Helu recognized the genius before him. He appointed Sun Tzu as a general. And what followed was a series of military campaigns that would validate Sun Tzu's theories and make one of the most powerful states in China. Now serving as a senior general of Wu, Sun Tzu began implementing his strategic principles on a grand scale. His first major campaign was against the kingdom of Chu, Wu's powerful western neighbor. Chu was enormous, one of the largest states in China, with vast resources and formidable armies. A conventional military thinker would have considered attacking Chu to be suicidal. But Sun Tzu didn't think conventionally. Instead of launching a massive frontal assault, he analyzed Chu's weaknesses. The kingdom was large or decentralized, with autonomous lords who maintained their own armies. Communication across its vast territory was slow. Most importantly, Chu was arrogant, having never faced a serious threat from Wu. Sun Tzu's campaign against Chu exemplified principles from the art of war. First, he used deception. He launched small raids to the north while secretly massing forces to the west. He sent diplomatic missions that suggested Wu sought peace while simultaneously planning invasion. He spread disinformation through merchants and travelers about Wu's internal problems and military weakness. When Sun Tzu finally struck, he didn't attack Chu directly. Instead, he targeted Chu's smaller allied states, cutting off its tributary relationships and economic networks. Each victory was swift and decisive, giving Chu no time to respond effectively. By the time Chu mobilized his main armies, Sun Tzu had already achieved strategic objectives and withdrawn, leaving Chu exhausted and frustrated. Then came the masterstroke. Chu finally massed a huge army for a decisive battle, confident they would crush Wu's forces. Sun Tzu appeared to accept the challenge, positioning his army in what seemed like a defensive formation. But when the Chu army advanced, expecting a pitched battle, Sun Tzu's forces melted away. They had already repositioned during the night, and while the Chu army exhausted itself pursuing shadows, Sun Tzu's forces struck at the now undefended Chu capital. The capital fell in days. The Chu king fled, and Sun Tzu had achieved what seemed impossible, defeating a superpower without fighting the grand battle his enemy had prepared for. This was Sun Tzu's philosophy made manifest. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Over the following years, Sun Tzu commanded or advised on multiple campaigns, each demonstrating different aspects of his strategic thinking. Against the kingdom of Qi, he used the rain to neutralize their superior cavalry. Against you in the south, he exploited their political divisions through careful intelligence work and targeted bribes. Time and again, he won through superior strategy, intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare rather than brute force. Historical sources suggest that Sun Tzu never lost a campaign, a claim that seems almost too perfect to be true, which is one reason some scholars doubt the historical accounts. But if even half these stories are accurate, Sun Tzu ranks among history's greatest military commanders. Now, let's dive into what makes the art of war so extraordinary. This isn't just a military manual. It's a profound meditation on strategy, leadership, psychology, and the nature of conflict itself. Written in elegant classical Chinese, it consists of 13 chapters, each focusing on different aspects of warfare. What makes it timeless? Let's explore some key principles. The most famous quote from the art of war is probably this: "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle." This seems simple, but it's revolutionary. Sun Tzu is arguing that victory isn't primarily about courage, strength, or superior weapons. It's about information and self-awareness. How much time do modern militaries spend on intelligence gathering? How much do businesses invest in market research and competitive analysis? Sun Tzu pioneered this approach 2,500 years ago. Sun Tzu repeatedly emphasizes that the highest form of warfare is to win without fighting. To fight and conquer in all your battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. This sounds paradoxical. Isn't the whole point of military power to fight battles? But Sun Tzu understood that battle is expensive, unpredictable, and destructive even for the winner. Instead, he advocates for achieving objectives through strategy, deception, diplomacy, and psychological pressure. Isolate your enemy politically. Undermine their alliances. Destroy their morale. Create conditions where fighting becomes unnecessary because the outcome is already determined. Modern special operations forces use this thinking. Covert action, psychological operations, and strategic communication can achieve what massive military campaigns cannot. Businesses understand this too. Sometimes the best way to defeat a competitor isn't to fight them in the market, but to make their products obsolete or their business model irrelevant. Here's a principle that makes some people uncomfortable. All warfare is based on deception. Hence, when able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must seem inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When far away, we must make him believe we are near. Sun Tzu isn't advocating for lying to your own people or troops. Quite the opposite. He emphasizes transparency and trust within your organization. But toward the enemy, deception is fundamental. War is not a fair sport. It's a deadly competition where the stakes are survival. This makes modern people squeamish because we like to think of honor and honesty as universal values. But Sun Tzu would argue that the greatest dishonor is to waste soldiers' lives through incompetent command. If deception can save lives and achieve objectives, it's not just permissible, it's morally required. Sun Tzu emphasizes, rapidity is the essence of war. Take advantage of the enemy's unreadiness. Make your way by unexpected routes and attack unguarded spots. In modern business terminology, this is about agility and first-mover advantage. Sun Tzu understood that while your enemy is making plans, if you can act decisively, you render those plans obsolete. Speed doesn't mean recklessness. It means making good decisions quickly and implementing them before your opponent can react. Several chapters of The Art of War focus on terrain, not just physical geography, but strategic positioning. Ground, which forms a key to 3 contiguous states, should be occupied first. Ground which can be abandoned but is hard to reoccupy is called entangling. Ground on which each side has liberty of movement is called accessible. Sun Tzu classified terrain into categories, each requiring different tactical approaches. But his real genius was in seeing terrain metaphorically. In business, terrain might be market position, technological infrastructure, or brand reputation. In politics, it's alliances, institutions, and public opinion. Sun Tzu has specific ideas about what makes an effective leader. The general who wins a battle makes many calculations in his temple before the battle is fought. The general who loses a battle makes but few calculations beforehand. Leadership, for Sun Tzu, means preparation, strategic thinking, and creating the conditions for victory before actual confrontation. But he also emphasizes a human element. Regard your soldiers as your children, and they will follow you into the deepest valleys. Look on them as your own beloved sons, and they will stand by you even unto death. Yet he balances his compassion with the necessity of discipline, as the concubine drill demonstrated. Good leaders inspire loyalty, but also maintain standards. They care for their people, but don't hesitate to enforce discipline when necessary. Perhaps the most sophisticated concept in the art of war is formlessness. Be extremely subtle, even to the point of formlessness. Be extremely mysterious, even to the point of soundlessness. Thereby, you can be the director of the opponent's fate. Sun Tzu argued that the ultimate strategic advantage is to have no fixed form that an enemy can analyze and counter. Water, he notes, has no constant shape but adapts to its container. Similarly, military strategy shouldn't be rigid but should flow and adapt to circumstances. This principle has profound implications beyond warfare. In business, companies that rigidly adhere to fixed strategies get disrupted by more adaptive competitors. In personal development, people who can adapt to changing circumstances struggle. Flexibility, adaptability, and a refusal to be predictable. These are enduring sources of power. The immediate impact of the art of war in ancient China was enormous. It became required reading for military officers and educated officials. During the warring states period that followed Sun Tzu's era, his principles were applied by numerous generals and strategists. the state of Qin, which eventually unified China, employed Sun Tzu's principles extensively in its campaigns. But the book's influence extended far beyond China. It spread throughout East Asia, deeply influencing Japanese samurai culture and Korean military thinking. In Japan, the art of war was studied by warlords, shoguns, and martial artists for centuries. Miyamoto Musashi, perhaps Japan's greatest swordsman, drew heavily on Sun Tzu's principles in his own Book of Five Rings. In the modern era, the art of war experienced a remarkable renaissance. It was translated into French in the 18th century and into English in the early 20th century, but it really exploded in popularity in the 1970s and 1980s. Military academies around the world added it to their curricula. West Point, Sandhurst, and military schools across Europe, Asia, and the Americas began teaching Sun Tzu alongside Clausewitz and other military theorists. But what's truly remarkable is how the art of war transcended military contexts. Business schools started teaching it. The book became popular in Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and corporate boardrooms worldwide. Sports coaches used it to develop competitive strategies. Politicians and diplomats studied it to understand power dynamics and negotiation. Why? Because people recognized that Sun Tzu wasn't just talking about warfare in the narrow sense. He was talking about any competitive, strategic endeavor. Replace army with organization, battle with market competition, and terrain with competitive landscape, and the art of war becomes a business strategy guide. Replace enemy with opponent, and you have a sports psychology manual. This adaptability is exactly what Sun Tzu would have advocated. Formlessness, flexibility, applying principles to changing circumstances. The art of war endures because its principles are abstract enough to apply to any strategic situation, but concrete enough to provide actionable guidance. But we need to acknowledge something important. Sun Tzu's philosophy has a dark side. His emphasis on deception, his apparent amorality about methods, and his focus on victory at any cost have been used to justify some troubling practices. Authoritarian regimes have cited Sun Tzu to justify manipulation of their populations. Corporate leaders have used his principles to rationalize cutthroat business practices that harm employees, communities, and the environment. The emphasis on deception has been twisted into permission for dishonesty in contexts where ethical behavior should prevail. Sun Tzu would likely argue that he's being misapplied. His philosophy assumed you were already in a competitive situation where the stakes were high. War, quite literally. He wasn't advocating for creating unnecessary conflicts or treating all human relationships as warfare. There's a difference between using strategic thinking in actual competition and viewing everything as a battlefield where any tactic is justified. Moreover, some critics argue that the art of war reflects a cynical worldview that perpetuates conflict rather than resolving it. If everyone is constantly strategizing, deceiving, and positioning for advantage, doesn't that make peaceful cooperation impossible? This is a valid criticism, and it points to the limits of Sun Tzu's philosophy. The art of war is extraordinarily useful for competitive situations, but it doesn't provide a vision for how to transcend competition and build genuine cooperation. For that, you'd need to turn to Confucius or Buddha or other philosophical traditions focused on harmony rather than strategic victory. But perhaps that's not Sun Tzu's job. He wrote a manual for a specific context, and its brilliance lies in how well it accomplishes that specific purpose. Let's bring this home to the present day. How is Sun Tzu's thinking applied right now in 2025? Corporate strategists explicitly use Sun Tzu's frameworks. When a tech company disrupts an industry through innovation rather than direct competition, that's subduing the enemy without fighting. When a startup avoids going head-to-head with established giants and instead finds an underserved market niche, that's choosing favorable terrain. When companies invest heavily in competitive intelligence, that's know your enemy. Netflix's strategy against Blockbuster is a perfect Sun Tzu case study. They didn't try to compete on Blockbuster's terms. Physical stores with more locations. They changed the battlefield entirely, first with mail delivery and then with streaming, making Blockbuster's strengths irrelevant. That's strategic thinking at the highest level. Modern cybersecurity is essentially Sun Tzu applied to digital warfare. The emphasis on defense in depth, deception technologies like honeypots, and importance of intelligence gathering all reflect art of war principles. When cybersecurity experts say, assume you're already compromised, that's Sun Tzu's know yourself. Understand your vulnerabilities before the enemy exploits them. Modern geopolitical strategy is full of Sun Tzu's influence. China's Belt and Road Initiative is sometimes analyzed through the lens of the art of war, expanding influence through infrastructure and economic relationships rather than military conquest. That's subduing without fighting. Information warfare, influence operations, and strategic communication campaigns by various nations reflect Sun Tzu's emphasis on psychology and deception. When countries invest heavily in soft power and public diplomacy, they're recognizing that military force isn't the only or even primary form of power. Championship coaches in every major sport study the art of war. Bill Belichick, one of American football's most successful coaches, is known to keep Sun Tzu's book nearby. The emphasis on preparation, knowing opponents' tendencies, and adapting strategy during competition all reflect Sun Tzu's principles. When a boxer studies an opponent's film to identify habits and weaknesses, that's Sun Tzu. When a football team uses deception plays and misdirection, that's Sun Tzu. When athletes develop mental toughness and strategic thinking, not just physical skills, that's Sun Tzu. Perhaps most interestingly, people apply the art of war to personal challenges. Battling addiction, overcoming career obstacles, or navigating difficult relationships can benefit from strategic thinking. The emphasis on self-knowledge, picking your battles, and not engaging in conflicts you can't win has psychological validity. Self-help gurus have sometimes oversimplified or distorted Sun Tzu's ideas, but the core insight remains valuable. Life involves competition and conflict, and strategic thinking helps you navigate these challenges more effectively. Lawyers and legal strategists study the art of war extensively. Trial preparation, negotiation tactics, and strategic litigation all benefit from Sun Tzu's principles. When lawyers decide whether to settle or go to trial, assess their case's strengths and weaknesses, and develop arguments that put opponents at a disadvantage, they're applying concepts that Sun Tzu articulated millennia ago. The principle attack where they are unprepared, go out to where they do not expect, applies perfectly to legal strategy. Find the weak points in opposing arguments, exploit procedural advantages, and create dilemmas for your opponents. So we return to our central question. Who was Sun Tzu? Did he exist? After examining all the evidence, here's what we can say with confidence. The art of war exists, and it's a work of genius. Whether it was written by a single individual named Sun Wu in the 6th century BCE, compiled by multiple strategists over centuries, or created by an anonymous military school in the state of Wu, almost doesn't matter. The ideas are what endure. But I'd argue there's something compelling about the traditional account. The voice in the art of war feels unified. The principles cohere into a complete philosophy. The examples and illustrations suggest someone with real military experience, not just theoretical knowledge. The pragmatic, unsentimental tone suggests a practitioner, not an academic. Moreover, the concubine drill story, whether historically accurate or apocryphal, captures something essential about the philosophy: the willingness to enforce discipline regardless of personal cost, the emphasis on clarity and preparation, and the understanding that effective organizations require both compassion and accountability. If Sun Tzu didn't exist, someone very much like him must have. The art of war comes from a mind or minds that understood warfare at the deepest level and could abstract that understanding into principles applicable far beyond the battlefield. That kind of insight doesn't emerge from committee or compilation. It requires genius. So perhaps the truth is somewhere in between. A historical figure named Sun Wu likely existed and served the kingdom of Wu. He developed revolutionary military strategies that led to remarkable victories. His teachings were compiled, perhaps by students or successors, into the text we know as the Art of War. Over time, the historical person and the philosophical text merge into the legendary Sun Tzu, neither entirely historical nor entirely mythical, but something in between. And perhaps that's fitting. Sun Tzu's philosophy emphasizes formlessness, the strategic advantage of being difficult to pin down. The man himself, or the idea of him, exists in the same liminal space, real enough to be credible, mysterious enough to be fascinating, universal enough to be timeless. As we come to the end of our journey through Sun Tzu's life, philosophy, and legacy, what should we take away? First, That strategic thinking is a fundamental human skill, as relevant today as it was 2,500 years ago. The specific tactics of warfare change, from bronze swords to cyber weapons, but the underlying principles of competition, preparation, and psychological understanding remain constant. Second, that intelligence and information are more powerful than brute force. Sun Tzu's emphasis on knowing yourself and your opponent, on understanding terrain and circumstances, and on fighting only when you've already secured victory through preparation. These insights have proven correct again and again throughout history. Third, that leadership requires balancing compassion with discipline, flexibility with decisiveness, and caution with boldness. The best strategies are those that achieve objectives while minimizing costs and casualties. Fourth, that adaptability is perhaps the ultimate strategic advantage. In a changing world, rigid systems fail while flexible ones survive and thrive. Sun Tzu's concept of formlessness, being like water, taking the shape of circumstances while maintaining your essential nature, is more relevant in our rapidly changing world than ever before. Finally, that wisdom transcends its original context. The Art of War was written for military commanders in ancient China, but its insights illuminate business, politics, sports, personal development, and any human endeavor involving competition, conflict, or strategic challenge. Sun Tzu, whether one person or many, whether purely historical or partly legendary, gave humanity a gift, a framework for thinking strategically that has enriched every culture it has touched, not by glorifying war, but by showing how to minimize its costs and, ideally, avoid it altogether through superior strategy. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. This isn't just a military principle. It's a philosophy of life. Find ways to achieve your goals that don't require destructive conflict. Use intelligence rather than force. Plan so thoroughly that execution becomes inevitable. Build advantages through preparation rather than scrambling in the moment of crisis. These principles have served humanity well for over 2 millennia, and they'll likely remain relevant for millennia to come. So here's my question for you as we close. In your own life, where are you fighting unnecessary battles? Where are you trying to use force when strategy would be more effective? What would it look like to apply Sun Tzu's principles not to warfare, but to your personal challenges, your career goals, or your relationships? And here's an even deeper question. If Sun Tzu were alive today, observing our modern world with its technological warfare, its information conflicts, its corporate battles, and its geopolitical tensions, what would he say? Would he recognize the application of his principles? Or would he argue we've misunderstood his core message? Would he be pleased to see the art of war in every business school and military academy? Or concerned that we've universalized a philosophy meant for specific contexts? I don't have those answers, but thinking about them can tell us a lot about ourselves and our world. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating and mysterious figures, please subscribe to our channel. We explore the lives, ideas, and legacies of the people who shaped human civilization. Philosophers, warriors, scientists, artists, and revolutionaries whose stories deserve to be told and whose wisdom deserves to be shared. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment with your thoughts on Sun Tzu, and let us know which historical figure you'd like us to cover next. Until next time, remember, the supreme art of life, like the supreme art of war, is to achieve your goals through wisdom rather than force, through preparation rather than desperation, and through strategy rather than struggle. Thanks for listening. Now go out there and conquer your battles, preferably without fighting them.